Welcome to the Race and Ethnicity Terms and Concepts and Definitions lecture. So this one will mostly focus on some of the major terms and concepts. We will have another lecture that looks at more of the theoretical perspectives. So whenever you're talking about the isms, gender, racism, sexism, ageism, the inequalities, classism, we're looking at the belief that one group is inherently better than another group. So with the minority group, what you're trying to do is oppress and discriminate against a particular group. So it's any category of people distinguished by physical or cultural differences that a society sets apart and subordinates. Now, we like to subordinate people that we can fairly easily recognize. So this distinct identity. You need to be able to look at somebody fairly quickly and understand whether they are the person that you're supposed to be discriminating against or not. So we tend to use things like race and gender and sexual orientation and poverty, social class indicators, what kind of shoes people are wearing, clothing, cars, that kind of stuff. We wouldn't ask for something like whether your big toe is larger than your second toe or your second toe is larger than your big toe, because then we'd have to have everybody take off their shoes when they come in and say, oh yeah, I get to discriminate against you. So we are fairly lazy and we want very easily seen characteristics when we're going to be discriminating. So this distinct identity is really important. Subordination, you need to have negative stereotypes, you need to have stigma, you need to have labeling, negative labeling, lower status. And group size is not a factor. If you look at women in America, they are the subordinate group. They outnumber men. If you look at apartheid in South Africa, blacks outnumbered whites. So minority doesn't necessarily mean minority in number. It just means this category of people that are distinguished by physical and cultural differences that are set apart and subordinated and discriminated against. So other definitions: prejudice, stereotyping, racism, institutional prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is that rigid and irrational generalization about an entire category. It's a prejudgment. You don't know this person, you don't know these people, you've never spoken to them, met with them, been to their family's house for dinner, you don't know them at all. Yet you have this rigid and irrational prejudgment about a group of people. And you don't let go of this real well. If you hold a prejudice toward a group of people and you meet somebody who defies that prejudice, all you're going to do is say, okay, I'm still prejudiced against that group of people, except for this one guy. I met this one guy. So you're not going to lose it. One or two people is not going to be enough to get rid of your prejudice. It's very difficult to leave that. The stereotyping is that exaggerated description about an entire category of people, oftentimes negative. Racism, the belief that one racial category is innately superior or inferior to another. I've been reading a book on early sociology in the United States, looking at the Atlanta School and their concerted efforts to debunk the idea of scientific racism, the idea that races are different, that science has found this out. We're talking 1895 to 1930, maybe not quite that long, but that time period, post-Civil War, deep into the Reconstruction period. So looking at that innately superiority. Institutional prejudice and discrimination is built into the operation of the institutions. So the idea that America is built in slavery, the institutions were built and developed and formed when slavery existed. So therefore you have to say that there is institutional prejudice and discrimination, institutional racism, because at the very beginning and founding of the nation, there was. Even like if you think about things like University of Alabama, built with slave labor. I mean, it's there. So it's a little bit harder to tease out sometimes or convince people, but it most definitely exists. The bias that's built into the very operation of the institutions and the history of the institutions and the very existence of the institutions. Some of the theories of prejudice, scapegoat theory, is when disadvantaged people are blaming minorities for their own problems. This is usually a way to divide and conquer, to have it's like when the economy was going bad in Germany and Hitler was like, it's the Jews, it's their fault. It's a way of taking the blame and taking the blame away from the people who deserve the blame and putting it on a group of people who have lower social status and cannot fight back. So that's the scapegoat theory, authoritarian personality theory. People who are very rigid in their thinking tend to see things in black and white, and that leads into racism and prejudice as well. They see this group versus that group and have very strong opinions of the different groups. Culture theory. If we have a culture that has prejudice embedded within it because we have institutional racism, then everybody has a piece of it. If we grow up in this culture, if we live in this culture, walk around in this culture, go to school in this culture, have families and grow families, and the culture includes institutional racism and prejudice, then we're all going to have it. It's there. It is embedded in the culture, and then it is up to us to do the work to combat the prejudices that we see in our culture that have come into ourselves, and then to fight them within the culture itself. And then conflict theory, again, divide and conquer, right? So self-justification for the rich and powerful, which we're going to look at in a minute. And then the climate of race consciousness, kind of like class consciousness, as Karl Marx was saying. Now, we are the 99. Now, this is a group that needs to fight for very specific things for this group, a racial consciousness, in order to win power and privileges. Discrimination is treating various categories of people unequally. You do not have to be prejudiced to discriminate. You can be non-prejudiced and still discriminate, especially with institutional racism and discrimination. And here is the actual chart that tells you that, and there's a misspelling. So if you are a prejudiced person and you discriminate, you are an active bigot. If you are a prejudiced person, you're not prejudiced and you discriminate. You're a fair weather liberal. And if you are prejudiced and you don't discriminate, you're a timid bigot. Maybe you think that nobody's going to come to your shop. You're going to get bad reviews, and you're not allowed to discriminate, so you won't, but you won't be happy about it. And then the all-weather liberal, you are not prejudiced and you're not discriminating. So you can be prejudiced, not prejudiced, and discriminate. You can be prejudiced and not discriminate. All right. So the vicious circle, this is where we start looking at the justification for the elites. So stage 1, you have prejudice and discrimination. It's an expression of ethnocentrism. It's an attempt to justify economic exploitation. United States is the very early history of the United States and the very beginning of the slave trade and the very beginning of the ownership of slaves. And then you say, as a result of prejudice and discrimination, a minority is socially disadvantaged, occupying a low position in the system of social stratification. So even after Civil War, you have Jim Crow laws, you have an entire system set to repress the group. And then the group isn't able to achieve. The group remains in poverty, or the group has health issues, or the group has, any kind of anything. This disadvantage that is displayed is then not interpreted as this group has been repressed since the 1600s. Instead, is it interpreted as this group is innately inferior, which unleashes a renewed prejudice and discrimination. The cycle repeats itself. So it's a good excuse for, you do the prejudice and discrimination, the social disadvantages show up, and then you say, aha, they can't succeed. So the belief in minorities and innate inferiority, so it justifies the existence and domination of the group, of the elite. Patterns of interaction. This is when we start to get real cheerful. This is really where we're occupying the same land, the same piece of dirt. And we don't do this particularly well. Different groups, different races, different genders, not different genders, different races, different ethnicities, different tribal identities, differences. So pluralism is a state in which racial and ethnic minorities are distinct but have social parity. So they're distinct but equal. You don't see this very often. In fact, very rarely. We tend to want to layer people and stratify and have some better than others. but this is a good thing to aim for. Assimilation is that process by which minorities adopt patterns of the dominant culture. And they always use as assimilation the idea of the Eastern European immigrants coming over and then losing their languages and everything and adapting into the dominant category. And we all kind of become, it's like the melting pot. It's like cheese melting. And then I saw another article and they call it a salad. We're not a bisque. We're not a nice cheddar. What's a good one? A cheddar beer soup. Nice beer, cheese, few other odds and ends, nice blended mesh, and then you like dip bread in it. That's not us. We are a chunky stew. We are a salad with maybe some dressing to hold us together. So assimilation may not be a very good and realistic way of looking at patterns of interaction. Segregation is what we do particularly well. We physically and socially separate categories of people, either in fact or by law. And then genocide, the systematic killing of one category of people by another, is probably what we do almost best. The in-groups and out-groups get to the point in which the dominant group dehumanizes the subordinate group and justifies their removal. So systematic killing of one category by another. So these are how we do or don't occupy the same piece of land particularly well. How to improve these things, educational processes, multicultural education, appreciating diversity, all those Department of Equity and Diversity type of initiatives that different workplaces have and schools have, but also increasing meaningful social contact and having that a desire to change, an honest self-critique of lifestyle, doing anti-racism work, looking at reading anti-racism books, and then planning for increasing social contact. It doesn't even have to be racism. If you realize in your entire life you have known 0 Jewish people, you could decide that this is a group that I would like to know more about. I would like to know their customs. I would like to know their religion. You would look at your life and say, well, how come I've never been in contact with anybody like this? In the South, there's not that many of them, right? So it's not an easy thing, a common thing to be in contact with somebody of that belief system. And then a plan for increasing social contact. How can I make opportunities to engage with people from this group? Do they have any outreach things? Do they have any festivals or something like that? I mean, the Greek Orthodox Church here in town has the Greek Festival. They used to have it every year. I don't know that they do anymore, but it's great food, and you get to understand a little bit more about the Greek Orthodox religion. The Muslim faith has outreach. They have dinners from time to time. They have a mosque on Sparkman Drive, and they have pretty good outreach. So that's another thing we can look at. But increasing meaningful social contact with groups of people that are different from you, and that desire to change and get to know them as people and not just get to know them as them is important.